A few weeks ago I counted down the 10 worst games based on a license for the 8-bit consoles, but now I'm here to talk about my 10 personal favorites for the NES. Games based on movies, television shows, cartoons, or comic books. Anything that's based on some sort of license from a major company. And for variety's sake, I'm not going to be including more than one of the classic Disney Capcom games on this list. So, without further ado, let's get to the countdown. Of all the games on this countdown, this one's probably the most controversial, as there's a lot of people out there who just don't like it. But Friday the 13th is one of my personal favorites, and one of the first true horror games to really make it onto a home console here in North America. You play as a group of camp counselors, and slowly but surely Jason works his way around Camp Crystal Lake, killing each of the counselors if you don't get there in time to stop them. The game is a bit confusing to figure out how the map works. Left and right don't seem to quite correlate with the actual map in-game, and there are maze-like settings like the forest or the cave for you to work your way through, so it can get frustrating really fast. There's a bit of clunkiness when it comes to the overall battling against Jason, but just the sheer concept, and once I fully understood the game as an adult, Friday the 13th has become one of my personal favorites. I've talked about it before, but Willow is easily one of my favorite games based on a film. It's a very Zelda-like top-down experience as you're exploring dungeons and traveling to various villages and dealing with citizens as the titular character of Willow, gaining new power-ups and weapons and defeating some epic bosses with some good Capcom music behind you, and it's still a relatively cheap game for the NES, so there's really not too many excuses to not check out Willow. Based on one of the odder licenses for the NES, The Lone Ranger from Konami is a stellar effort, with a good soundtrack to back up the Wild West scenario and multiple different styles of the action to play through, including top-down perspective and first-person mode where you'll be blasting through enemies. There's even towns to explore and a pretty big map that you'll be able to move the Lone Ranger around. Even if you're completely unfamiliar with the Lone Ranger himself, this is definitely a game you should check out. While the cartoon may have been relatively short-lived, Bucky OHare is one of my favorite 8-bit NES licensed titles. Getting to play as Bucky and members of his team like Jenny and the awesome Dead-Eye Duck, with each of the characters having multiple different abilities that they'll be able to use to help you navigate the various different levels. You have side-scrolling levels you'll have to go from bottom to top, and some pretty epic bosses with some steep difficulty, lots of instant deaths throughout the course of the game. But even with that, the music will definitely keep you going as you're blasting your way through the enemies and make your way through Bucky OHare. Being a sequel to a relatively obscure NES title that was only released limitedly here in the US and mostly in Japan, Goonies 2 is still based on the film from the 1980s. You get to play as the leader of the Goonies, Mikey, and you're exploring a pretty vast area where you'll have to find power-ups to go back and traverse previously inaccessible areas, go into a first-person perspective to find secrets and save the various members of the Goonies team. There's some great music that goes along with some of the areas, including the awesome rendition of Cyndi Lauper's Goonies Are Good Enough. But overall, Goonies 2, while not directly based on a film since there was no actual sequel to the movie, but still a great license-based game for the NES. Based on one of my absolute favorite cartoons growing up, Tiny Toon Adventures saw a plethora of releases for various home consoles, and one of my favorites is the first Tiny Toon game on the NES. Getting to platform as various members of the Tiny Toons team, stomping your way on various enemies and defeating bosses that are instantly recognizable for the most part from the cartoon itself, including even one of the Star Wars parody bosses throughout the course of the game itself. Tiny Toon Adventures is definitely one of the funner license-based platformers for the system. While there are 4 games based on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle license for the NES, the one I'm going for on this list is TMNT 3, The Manhattan Project. Keeping the same fun and enjoyable co-op style gameplay of the TMNT 2 arcade port, TMNT 3 has more levels to beat up various members of the Foot Clan and of course conquer various villains from the long-running cartoon series. While I actually enjoy most of the TMNT games for NES, Manhattan Project is definitely my favorite. While it may not be known to some, Little Nemo the Dream Master, one of my favorite platformers for NES, is actually based on a license. It's based on the cartoon film that was released in the early 90s, and it too was also based on the comic strip from the early 1900s. Little Nemo gets to travel through various worlds in the Dreamland, feeding candy to animals in order to actually ride in them or on them, in order to help platform and climb your way through the various levels. While an extremely difficult game overall, Little Nemo is still one of my absolute favorites from my childhood, and one I couldn't stop playing. By far my favorite DC comic-based superhero is Batman, and The Dark Knight got 3 games on the NES, but of course my favorite is Batman, the original based on the 1989 film. The game has some pretty awesome gameplay, being able to jump from wall to wall and off of platforms using Batman, punch or use your various bat gadgets in order to take out the enemies. While a lot of the villains weren't really from the movie or made any sense of who they actually were, Batman on NES not only had an amazing soundtrack from Sunsoft, it's still extremely fun to play now. Before we get to number 1, let's look at some honorable mentions. I love Zelda 2, even though it's considered by some the black sheep of the Zelda franchise, Zelda 2 is one of my favorites. And Rambo for the NES, based on of course the film franchise, included pretty much identical gameplay in many ways to Legend of Zelda 2. Controlling Rambo through the various jungle settings, which can get a bit difficult to navigate through, and you can use your trusty knife in order to stab quite a few enemies. While it may not be the most stellar of licensed games, Rambo is still one of those ones that I still enjoy playing now. Based on the long-running European comic and only released in PAL territories, Asterix received many home-released games based on it. But the Asterix game for the NES is one of my favorites. It's a relatively average platformer, but the reason I love this game and wanted to mention it here is the soundtrack. The ending song to the game is absolutely one of my favorite 8-bit tracks, and I highly recommend you track it down and give it a listen for yourself. You will not be disappointed. While it is based on the arcade port, Popeye for NES is still one of my absolute favorite arcade-style games for the system. Controlling Popeye, collecting various items, and interacting with characters like Olive Oyl and Sweet Pea while avoiding the evil Bluto is still enjoyable, and anytime I either see the game for NES or the arcade cabinet, I always have to give it a play. I enjoy almost all of the Disney Capcom-based games, but my absolute favorite will always be Ducktales. Based on one of the absolute best cartoons of all time, Ducktales has one of the best soundtracks to go along with the various levels. The iconic Moon level, which has been remixed and covered so many countless times, just searching on YouTube you'll find dozens of various different versions of the song. But it's the gameplay that still makes the game enjoyable and worth putting into the NES at least once or twice a year just for fun. Controlling Uncle Scrooge and pogo sticking using his cane on top of the various enemies like the Beagle Boys or the evil Magica Dispel. While it is a relatively short game and playing it now, it's still a pretty easy game considering the toughness of a lot of NES games. But DuckTales was one of the first NES games that I ever played as a kid, and will always be one of my absolute favorites for the system. So there you have it, my favorite license-based games for the NES. Which ones are your personal favorites? Is there any I missed or didn't talk about that you've always personally loved? Be sure to check out my countdown where I count down the absolute worst ones for 8-bit consoles a few weeks back as well. Also, let me know, of the Disney Capcom games, while I gave the edge to DuckTales for this video, I do really love most of them, especially Chip 'n Dale. But which one is your personal favorite? And is there any other countdowns you would like to see me cover in the future? But anyway, guys, that'll wrap up this countdown video. Thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.